noting once again what God had promised to Abraham. So that's Roman numeral number 1, which I'm going to erase here in just a moment. But specifically, God promised Abraham that he would make of him, the term is a great nation. I've talked about this. I've mentioned this already, but that's the first promise. He will make of him a great nation. I don't think I really unpacked this, although I did say last Sunday that the word nation is the word goy. It's the singular for the word goyim, which is the word nations or gentiles. Yeah. So the nations are the goyim, as opposed to the Jews, who consider themselves to be the people of God. That distinction the Jews make between Gentiles and corporate Israel as the people of God is truly a biblical perspective. But it's not entirely appropriate to use the word goy in making the distinction, because the scripture tells us the people of God will become a great goy. So, and that we have in Genesis, that's in Genesis 12:2, right in that passage where God first talks to Abraham. It's, you know, it's actually in other places too. It's in 17:5, it's in 18:18. So the idea that the God is going to have a great nation through Abraham is repeated often. So that's important. So God intentionally used this word to make his promise to Abraham. The term signifies a nation. Now that term has 3 identifying features. So let's talk about that. 1 race, 1 government, and 1 territory. So that's a nation. By using the term, God was promising Abraham's descendants, 1 race, that they would one day dwell in their own land, 1 territory, and they would be ruled over by their own king, 1 government. So in several other passages, God elaborates on the promise he made to Abraham. And these promises confirm what God meant when he said he would make a nation. So if you do a brief survey of these passages that talk about this, you're going to find out that there are actually 4 features to this. And so obviously one is descendants. You have to have people. People are the foundation. Secondly, there's going to be a land. Third, there's going to be, maybe I'll just say, royalty. There's going to be a king. There's going to be a royal lineage. You have to have something. This is the idea of government. You have to have it. And then fourth, along with this, there's this idea of blessing. So these 4 elements comprise what it means for Abraham to be made into a great nation. Descendants, land, royal lineage, blessing. And we'll get into this more as we move along, because these facts will become important as we continue. So most often the Hebrew that refers to descendants is this word is this word, Hebrew word zeroah, which is the word for seed, and the English word descendant is a normal translation for this word, but it doesn't tell you everything. So now, I just want to read, I'm going to read as fast as I can through scriptures, and I may not even read all of them, but we're going to just jump in as fast as we can and just look at these, or maybe we don't need to, because maybe we already believe this, and Genesis 13:16 is the first passage that I'm thinking about. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can be numbered. Then off on to Genesis 15, and he took him outside and said, now look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you're able to count them. And he said, so shall your descendants be. So God was reaffirming the promise he made to Abraham several times. And God's use of the Hebrew term in the promise he made was not an accident. Like we said, it's a collective term, but it is like the word fish. It can be plural, it can be singular. From the beginning, God intended that the seed of Abraham should receive legal title to everything promised at the time of the fulfillment of the promise. Okay, so we have, we're going to be looking at this in more detail as we move along, but it shouldn't be too hard to understand this, especially from Abraham's point of view, that we have Abraham. So I'll just say, here's Abraham. That little dot means Abraham. And then we have Isaac. And then we have Jacob. And then we have Jacob's sons. We have the Patriarchs. And then we're going to get over here to, eventually we're going to have corporate Israel. So Abraham is the heir of the promise, and he doesn't live in the time of the fulfillment of the promise. He doesn't live in the unpackaging of what was promised. So if we think of the package, last time I drew a box, and this box has in it, this box is the promise, but what's in the box is what was promised. There's two different things here. So Abraham is heir of the promise. He gets the box. He passes the box on to Isaac. But Isaac doesn't get to the fulfillment of the promise. He passes it on to his son, Jacob. Okay. This is interesting because God is actually controlling how things are working. God intended, ultimately, for one thing to happen. And Galatians chapter 3, verse 16 is an interpretive key. So we're looking at the way the New Testament looks at the Old Testament. So we have to go back to the New Testament. So we're going to see over time that the New Testament gives us interpretive keys to apply to the Old Testament, so that we can understand the Old Testament from the perspective that the Messiah has come. So Galatians 3, beginning with verse 16, This is possibly the key interpretive text for the Old Testament. But there are many interpretive keys. But Galatians 3:16 is right up there. So Galatians 3:16 says, now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. He does not say and to seed as referring to many, but rather to one. And to your seed, that is Christ. So that's a really basic interpretive key. So what we find in the New Testament is that God intended Jesus Christ ultimately to be the heir of the promise. He's over here. This is all Old Testament, but he's in the New Testament. Okay. And that's really an important passage. Okay, so then we have passages like Genesis 17, Genesis 17, beginning with verse 8. I will give to you and your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So the scriptures record the boundaries of the land. That's Genesis 17:8. And then, listen to this, Genesis 15:18. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I've given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river with the river Euphrates, to the Kenite, and the Kenizzite, and the Cadmonite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Rephaim, and the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Girgashite, and the Jebusite. Okay, now the scriptures don't tell us why, but the land included in the promise made to Abraham in this passage far exceeds the boundaries of the land that God allowed the sons of Israel to settle in 40 years after the Exodus. Under the directions God gave to Joshua, the sons of Israel were only allowed to occupy just the hill country in central Palestine, Galilee, and parts of the Transjordan. That's not the full picture of what God gave them. So that's the land promise. I'm still looking at the idea of the promise. Part 3, a royal lineage. God also promised Abraham at least some of his seed would reign as kings. Presumably, one of them would reign as king over the great nation that he promised Abraham his seed would eventually become. So we have passages like Genesis 17 and verse 6, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. Or Genesis 17, 15 to 16. Then God said to Abraham, as for Sarah your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from you. So that's the third. That's the third part of the.
What was that scripture?
That was Genesis 17, 15 to 16. So moving on to part 4, the blessing. Finally, God promised Abraham that not only his nation, but also all the other nations of the world would receive the blessing through the lineage. So we have that, and we have that in the well-known Genesis 12 verse 3 passage that we've quoted many times. We could also quote Genesis 18:18, since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So that's what we're looking at. So these 4 things are the central elements of the promise God made to Abraham, but it still remains for us to see how the inheritance of the promise contributes to the fulfillment of the promise at the time when the heir of the promise actually received what was promised. Okay? Are you hearing this?
Yes.
Okay. So again, we can talk about Abraham is the heir of the promise, but he didn't receive the promise. He didn't receive what was promised. He received the promise, but not what was promised. We have to make these distinctions in order to understand the Scripture. So now, I said that probably the major interpretive key, at least it's the major interpretive key I've come up with until something else, until I see something else, whatever that would be, I would be open. But I see Galatians 3:16 as the interpretive key, but not the only one. And I think we're going to have to look in the New Testament and see the composite picture of those passages that tell us how to interpret the Old Testament in the light of the New in order to really understand what God is saying. Here's another one, and I don't know that we can completely unpack this one, but this is definitely an interpretive key, and that is Romans 4 and verse 13. And it says, "For the promise to Abraham or to his descendants," remember that means, the word means seed, "that he would be heir of the world. For the promise to Abraham or to his seed that he would be heir of the world." Hold it, wait. The promise to Abraham or to his seeds that he would be heir of the what? The world. Whoa! And that's the word cosmos. It was not through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. Oh, wow. So there's something going on in the way that we're supposed to look at things in the Old Testament in light of the New, but that scripture is like another key to help us unlock this mystery.
Expansion.
Yeah, exactly. Clearly there's more here than meets the eye. When you make a covenant, when God made a covenant with Abraham, he was still in the beginning stages of his master plan for the whole world. And in the New Testament, God was promising the entire earth to the seed of Abraham. We'll come back to this issue of land promises again in the future. Okay, so now we've looked at that. We want to talk about God selecting the heir. That's part 2 of what I have to give you today. Okay, so part 2. In part 2, I want to talk about several things. Okay.
That's all right.
So I want to talk about one. I want to talk about Abraham's question. I want to talk about Ishmael. I want to talk about the sign and cutting off. And I want to talk about 4, Ishmael, no, Isaac, yes. Okay. All right. So here's what we have. From the outset, God sought the promise given, from the outset, Abraham looked for the promise given to him as an inheritance that he could hand down to his heir at his death. It's going to be part of the package. He's going to pass this package on. We don't open the package yet, but we're passing the package on. Unfortunately, he didn't have children. Sarah was beyond the age of childbearing. He assumed the promise would become another part of his estate when he died. So he had no son, so he concluded that his slave, Eliezer of Damascus, would inherit the promise from him. When God appeared to him in a vision to reaffirm the promise, Abraham asked why he would make such a tremendous promise when he had no natural son. So God responds to that in Genesis 15, and these are well-traveled passages, but we need to just look at them in order to understand their significance as Moses is unpacking something incredibly important for us to understand. So Genesis 15, 1-6, that's where God appears to Abraham in a vision, says, "Don't fear, Abraham, I'm a shield to you, your reward will be great." Abraham says, "What will you give me? I'm childless. How about Eliezer of Damascus?" And God says, "Nope, this man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body will be your heir." And he takes him outside and says, "Look at the heavens, count the stars, if you're able to count them." And he says, "That's like your descendants." And he believed in the Lord, and God reckoned it to him for righteousness. That's a really key passage, quoted over and over again in the New Testament. Okay, so God answered Abraham's question by doing what? By making him another promise. He said he was not only ensured that Abraham would personally father his son who could inherit the promise, he was going to give him many other male descendants. So Moses wrote this account, and Moses' concern here, if you can get this, he's writing, I'm not saying it's not from God. The scripture is totally from God. But Moses did have an understanding of why he was writing what he was writing. And this is going to come out if you watch carefully, is that Moses, his concern is to track the inheritance of the promise. Okay? If you don't see this, you're going to miss something that's really important. Because, so what do we have? Who do we have rejected here?
Ishmael?
Yeah, well, basically, now over here, there's Abraham and there's Lot.
Oh, yeah.
Cross out Lot. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Now for Isaac, it's going to be who?
Ishmael.
We're going to be Ishmael. Cross out Ishmael. What about Jacob?
Esau.
Esau.
Esau. Cross out Esau. And then things shift a little bit when we get to the patriarchs. And we can talk about why there's a shift there. But what we have is God is clearly controlling who gets the box.
Yeah.
He's saying, no, Abraham, no, only Abraham's seed, not Lot. No, not only Isaac, certainly not Eliezer of Damascus.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is not just his focus here. This is Moses' focus in the entire book of Genesis. So once you see that, some of the stories fit in place because they have a purpose, is to show how the promise actually comes down. So that explains why there's some stories in here that they're in here. Okay. Unless we get this, we'll miss the key element hidden in these Hebrew scriptures. So God's announcement had to have caught Abraham by surprise. He didn't know this. But he did manage to ask God how he could be certain God would fulfill the promise he made. God's reaction was a solemn oath, symbolically moving between the halves of the sacrificial animals as a torch of fire. And he assured Abraham that he would fulfill the promise, but not for at least another 400 years, long after Abraham was dead. Okay, so now moving along into Genesis 15, verses 7 to 21. And in that passage, this is what we have, this whole idea of the making of the covenant. So, soon after God spoke to Abraham, Sarah gave Abraham her maidservant Hagar as a concubine. When Hagar delivered Abraham's firstborn son, Abraham thought he was the natural-born son God had promised. He assumed Ishmael. Now see, now God has said, okay, not Eliezer. So in Abraham's mind, okay, it has to be a natural-born son in order to inherit this promise. I can't give the box to anybody but a natural-born son. So he just assumed Ishmael would inherit the promise. So what does God do? Well, God in Genesis 17, that was 15, now God appears to him again because he doesn't have it right yet. So this time God's specific concern was that Abraham understand Ishmael will not inherit the promise from him. God is controlling who inherits the promise. God designated Isaac as the one he intended to become the heir of the promise. God said, Ishmael, I'll bless him. He's your son.
Yeah.
But he's not your heir.
Yeah.
He's not, he doesn't have that role. So in this passage, God makes it perfectly clear that he does not intend for the promise to fall into the hands of anybody who just might seem to be the heir of the promise. His statements solve only the immediate problem of who would inherit the promise when Abraham dies. That's not controlling the inheritance of the promise in the future. However, God had already laid out one requirement he was going to impose on the inheritance of the promise. So now we're going to look in Genesis 17, and we're looking at all the way from 17:1 through 14. So Abraham, God, he restates the promise that he made already twice. He reveals the terms on which all future heirs of the promise would have to qualify for the inheritance of the promise, and they'd be qualified only if they adhered to the terms of the covenant. That's Genesis 17, a legal agreement. And in Genesis 17, there's a really specific condition in Genesis 17. The heir of the promise has to be what? Circumcised. And he has to have the sign of God's covenant inscribed in his flesh. The solitary condition that God imposes, circumcision, plainly reveals that God plans to continue to control the inheritance of the promise into the future. Now later on, what we're going to find out is that requirement is going to apply over here with corporate Israel, uncircumcised. No. You see how this is, there is still control. God is still controlling what's happening with the inheritance of the promise. It gets passed on to the patriarchs from Jacob. It winds up in corporate Israel. And we talk about this because there are things that happen here that are very, require a shift in strategy. So in this passage, God is concerned with establishing a sign by which he can determine who is and who is not qualified to be the heir of the promise. Again, this is significant. God didn't consider every natural-born descendant of Abraham to be qualified to inherit the promise. It reveals the fate of a seed who was not qualified. Okay, so let's just talk about that. The fate of a seed who does not qualify. So, and now we're in Genesis 17, and we notice that God is setting things up for the future. Let's see. So in Genesis 17, key verse, I said Genesis 17, 1 to 14. Look at just the last verse. Verse 13. A servant is born in your house who is bought with your money, he shall surely be circumcised. Okay. Verse 11, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. So the sign of the covenant, Genesis 17:11, is circumcision. Okay, so that's the word. That's why I'm talking about the word sign. I'm going through this Abraham's question, Ishmael, I'm on number 3 right here. Okay. But I really want to read verse 14, because this is really important. This gets more important. Actually, this becomes incredibly important if you can see it in the Old Testament, but we haven't gotten there yet. So we're not ready to unpack this right now, so just a hint and we'll see more. Verse 14, but an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Now, the Jews circumcised babies, male babies, okay, on the 8th day. But if there was a baby that was not circumcised, then that person is cut off from God's people. He broke the covenant. Whoa! What are we going to do? Now, we are not talking about killing babies. Okay? God isn't talking about killing babies. God is, and this is key, God is talking about who could possibly get the box. God is talking about who could be an heir of the promise. If you are not circumcised, you can't be an heir of the promise. Because the whole covenant of circumcision insists you have to be. So, the sign is circumcision. Cutting off is what God does to someone who does not have the sign. It doesn't mean they are murdered. Now, later on, we will have to make a careful distinction between cutting off from and cutting off. Because the Bible does talk about, and later on in the rest of the Pentateuch, talk about those who flagrantly violate the covenant and says that they should be cut off, and it clearly does mean they should not survive, they should be stoned or whatever. The God here isn't talking about that. What he's talking about here is whether or not that person can possibly be considered as an heir of the promise. Okay. So that tells us again that God planned to continue to control the inheritance of the promise. So this passage, that's Genesis 17, 1-14, is concerned with establishing a sign by which God can determine who is and who is not qualified. This is significant. Again, I'm saying the same thing over and over again, but you just need to understand this. God did not consider every natural-born descendant of Abraham to be qualified to inherit the promise. This reveals that the fate of a seed of Abraham, who is not qualified, he's broken the covenant. He would be, he'd be cut off from the people, which again doesn't necessarily mean that that person wouldn't be among the Israelites. In fact, what we have later on in the Old Testament places where God says, if you do this, you are cut off. But what if you did it in secret? And nobody knew. Would you still be cut off? The answer is yeah, because God's doing the cutting. So we're going to find out that Israel later on is a pretty mixed bag. So the promise, the covenant, and circumcision as the sign of that covenant are the primary focus of the passage that we just referred to. That alone, again, allows us to define the essential meaning of the idiom cut off from. Anyone cut off from his people will no longer be a member of the people who are eligible to inherit the promise or to receive the legal title to what was promised. So we shouldn't be surprised when we learn later that from time to time, God let us know that he had cut off from corporate Israel large segments of the population. Moses tells us Isaac became the heir of the promise just as God had planned. When Sarah weaned Isaac, she insisted that he and he alone would be Abraham's heir and inherit the promise in accordance with God's plan. So, another passage I'm using is Genesis 28, beginning with verse 8, and this is the passage I'm referring to. Moses' purpose in this passage is to confirm that Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son, held no further claim to the promise God made to Abraham. That's why the passage is in there. He tells us Abraham not only allowed Sarah to send away Hagar and Ishmael, but then it says later on, after he had sons by another woman, Keturah, Abraham was careful to do with them just as Sarah had done with Ishmael. He sent them away after giving them a portion of his estate while he was still alive. And Abraham did that because he wanted to make sure the promise would go to Isaac as the heir of the promise. And sending away, this is a funny statement because Abraham has a vast territory. Sending them away isn't like, oh, they go a block away and now they're away. We don't know where they were, but they're probably still in Abraham's territory. So sending away was more like a legal thing than a physical distance idea. Okay, so now to Genesis 21, 5 and 6. So we shouldn't be surprised to find out. Okay, now we're moving on now to Genesis 25. Sorry, Genesis 25.
Did we ask questions yet?
I need to reserve the right not to answer because I'm trying to cover a lot of material.
Okay.
Can we wait? Can we be all right to wait? I do want to answer your questions.
Yeah.
Is that all right? Let's
I
just.
just needed a yes or no.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. A circumcision is required on the 8th day due to our blood and flooding and clotting
Yes.
and everything. So a baby doesn't decide if it gets
No.
circumcised.
I know. That's a funny thing.
It is.
That's a funny thing. That's really true. That is true. Okay. Yeah. So we shouldn't be surprised to find that when Abraham died, Isaac was in sole possession of the promise, which is now also being called the blessing. Therefore God blessed him just as he promised Abraham he would. So now we're in Genesis 25, verses 7 to 11. And so it starts out saying, these are all the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and he died. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him, and so on. Well, we're moving now from Abraham to Isaac, and we're moving to Jacob. So moving along, what Moses is doing is he's tracking the next heir of the promise. That heir turns out to be Isaac's son Jacob. First, Moses tells us about the birth of Isaac's two sons, the twins Esau and Jacob. The Lord told their mother Rebekah during her pregnancy that her eldest son Esau would not be the heir of the promise. Genesis 25, 20 to 26. I'm not going to read it. Moses informs us that Jacob's inheritance consisted of two parts, the birthright and the blessing. So, and then he recounts, he's illustrating the difference, but he recounts how Esau sold Jacob his birthright for a bowl of stew. And then Genesis 25, moving toward the end of that chapter, Moses is not just telling the tale. He recounts how Esau sold his birthright. Again, Moses is presenting a trail of evidence to show how Jacob became the heir of the promise God made to Abraham. His account of Esau selling the birthright to Jacob is intended to show Esau as one not worthy of inheriting the promise because he placed no value on the opportunity to do so.
Yeah.
So that's, Moses is teasing out the meaning of the history that he has. By possessing the birthright of the firstborn son, Esau was also entitled to inherit any special family heritage. Meaning, of course, that the box we've talked about, the promise, would be passed to Esau. The promise qualified as this special heritage. That's why Moses concludes his story of Isaac's life with this account of how his son Jacob became the heir of the promise through deception. We need to understand that the promise didn't go
Yeah.
to Esau, it did go to Jacob. He describes how Isaac summoned Esau while on his deathbed, fully intending to hand down the promise before he died. But Rebekah, remember, she overheard Isaac talking to Esau. She realized what was about to happen. So this is amazing because it's a verbal, the conveyance is verbal. This is, and so she subverted Isaac's plans by helping her favorite son, Jacob, obtain the promise through deceit. So now we're into Genesis 27, and that whole, basically the whole chapter virtually. Esau comes in later, and he expects to receive the promise that Isaac wanted him to have. But Esau had nothing left to give, because he had already handed down the promise verbally, the blessing of Abraham to Jacob. And so Esau is devastated. So this passage in Genesis 27 makes it clear that the blessing Jacob stole from Esau was the promise God made to Abraham. That's key. Even though he stole it, he got it. Moses even calls it in that passage, in Genesis 27, calls it the blessing of Abraham. So now we jump to Genesis 28. Having just told us how Jacob used treachery to inherit the promise God made to Abraham, Moses immediately shifts its focus to the details of Jacob's life following his inheritance of the promise. Moses wants it understood that in spite of this treachery, Jacob had indeed inherited the promise God made to Abraham. He wants that known. So he shifts just to emphasize that. He begins by recounting an incident that occurred shortly after Isaac handed down the promise to Abraham. That's in Genesis, beginning Genesis 28:10. It's the dream that Jacob has. And and it's about this house. Okay, so you compare the statements God made to Jacob in this passage with the statements that he made to Abraham and to Isaac on other occasions. They're almost exactly the same. We could quote Genesis 12:3, "And you all the nations of the earth be blessed. Bless you, you have the promise." Genesis 13, Genesis 15 we looked at. So it's very clear, and Moses wants you to understand, Jacob got the promise even though, wow, the way he did it was pretty bad. So Genesis 26, 2 to 5. This is to Isaac. It's the promise. Again, I won't read it. God had a distinct purpose in including passages like this one I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven. I will give your seed all these lands. By your descendants, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. That's the key phrase. All the nations of the earth shall be blessed in your seed. That's what we looked at this passage in Galatians at one point. So Moses had a very distinct purpose in his this repetitive thing. He's including passages like these to show how and to whom the patriarchs handed down the promise from one heir of the promise to the next. So, now we want to just think a little bit about the word Israel. That word didn't originate with man. God gave it to Jacob after Jacob was firmly in possession of the promise. Jacob had already left the promised land and he was on his way back after an absence of 14 years. And at that time he encountered the divine presence in the form of a man. He wrestled with God and he came away with a new name. Okay, so Jacob is becoming Israel. And this is going to be important later on because eventually we're going to talk about Israel and we're not even going to think about Jacob. We're just going to think about the whole nation. So, okay. So, let's see. Okay. So just as in the case with the death of Abraham and Isaac, Moses' purpose was to record how the promise was being handed down to the next heir. And now we get into some confusion. Because as Jacob lay on his deathbed, his favorite son Joseph comes to him with his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Knowing he was about to die, Jacob began to hand down the promise to his sons and his two grandsons. So now we're getting to the end of Genesis, and I'm looking at Genesis 48, verses 1 to 4, Israel's last days. Okay, so immediately, Jacob says, God Almighty appeared to me, I'm going to make you fruitful, I'll make you come be peoples, I'll give you this land, so on. So after he speaks this way, Jacob declares his intention to include Ephraim and Manasseh, the eldest of Joseph's sons, among the heirs of the promise, as though they were his own sons instead of his grandsons. He really likes these two grandsons. So he reaches out to bless, and having stated his intention with regard to his grandsons Ephraim and Manasseh, Jacob realizes the two boys are present. And so Jacob follows through with his declared intention by blessing the two sons of Joseph as though they were his own sons. And over the objection of their father Joseph, Jacob even insisted that the youngest son, Ephraim, is to be in a position superior to his older brother. And he specified this by placing his right hand on the boy's head as he blessed him. So what's happening, Genesis 48, 13 to 22, is that Jacob is handing down part of the promise to Ephraim and Manasseh. Jacob summoned his other sons and handed down other parts of the promise to them, just as Abraham had handed down the promise to Isaac, and Isaac had handed down the promise to him. But only one tribe had a recognizable part of the promise. Because remember the promise is, we looked at the four parts of the promise, but only Judah has a recognizable part. And that's the part about the royal lineage. Judah gets that piece of the promise. He obtains the divine right to rule as a king. All the other sons, with possible exception of Simeon and Levi, the Jacob cursed, they get only a partial share. They're all sharing this promise together. So Genesis 49, 1 to 27. So what happens when we move from Jacob to the patriarchs is that there's a splitting here where the promise the promise goes to these patriarchs. So Moses concludes the first part of his history of the promise by recounting the death of Jacob. But his account leaves the promise in a very uncertain state. After Jacob handed down the promise to his sons and grandsons, not one heir of the promise had title to all the elements of the promise, as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob got the whole package. It just went to them. It went from one man to one man to one man, but now it's distributed amongst 12. So Jacob distributed the promise in a way that poses a distinct threat to its fulfillment. You just have to see this. Several questions arise. So now I'm to the questions. The unanswered questions as of yet. So first of all, we have, this is a little bit confusing, and this is why Genesis, you just can't stop with Genesis at the end of Genesis. So, how have the various parts of the promise been distributed among all these heirs of the promise? It's obvious Judah holds part of the promise related to kingship as an inheritance, but which one of Jacob's sons holds part of the promise related to the land, for instance? Or how will all the heirs of Israel, the man Jacob, be able to participate in the fulfillment of the promise when none of them holds equitable title to the entirety of the promise? These and other questions seek answers, but the one question that fairly demands an answer is this: what about the uncircumcised descendants of Jacob? Since that individual has broken the covenant, how is he excluded from the people who are qualified to inherit the promises? That is, what does it mean that he will be cut off from his people? And that's where we have to leave it today. Okay, so what we've done is we've looked at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as receiving the box, but they can't open the box. The box will be opened at God never tells us when the promises will be fulfilled and when he's going to open that box and when he's going to say, now you who are heirs of the promise, now you get to inherit what was promised. He doesn't tell us.
Yeah.
But we do know that the promise gets distributed with the patriarchs, and it's now parceled out. And so that's going to translate over to how we're going to have to think about corporate Israel, because corporate Israel directly comes from the patriarchs. So,
At the point of patriarchs, now you've got 4 mothers.
Yeah.
Good one.
all right.
Time's up.
All right. Time is up. Now, I'm actually not going to do the class next week.
Okay.
And
Cliffhanger.
I'd leave you on a cliffhanger, I'm so sorry. And I don't know if I'll do it the following week, but we'll get back to it.
Okay.
But anyway.